Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Rana Foroohar. She's an associate editor at the Financial Times. She's CNN's global economic analyst. And we're going to talk about her work with economics and her book, a homecoming book, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Globalist World. So, Rana, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background. Looks like you have a very, very extensive background in journalism and economics for a long time. And then I want to ask you about, what's happening currently. But background first, if you would.
Sure. So I've been a journalist for 32 years. I had a brief foray during that period into venture capital, but quickly went back to journalism. I realized it's a lot easier to write about business than to actually start them. I've worked in the U.S., in Europe, in Asia. I've traveled a lot. I have run economics and business for Newsweek and Time magazine before I became a columnist at the Financial Times. I'm the author of 3 books, most recently Homecoming. And I am also CNN's global economic analyst. So, my job, which I feel very lucky to have, is running around, talking to interesting people, and trying to come up with some perceptions about where the economy and business are headed.
Well, before we get into your book, what's it like being a journalist, right now in, the end of 2022? Like, how has journalism changed for you the past few years? Is it harder, easier, different? What does it look like?
Well, I got into the business in 1992, and I would say that was pretty close to the peak print journalism. After that, by 95, you had the commercial internet really beginning to take off, and that created a hollowing out in print journalism. And, so I've in some ways always worked in a structurally declining industry. That said, I've been lucky to be able to work with some great publications, and the last few years, in fact, have actually been very good for journalism, print journalism, high-end print journalism, I would say, because, with all the misinformation, disinformation out there, I think that the subscription model, which is what the FT certainly follows, and others like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I think that has really taken off because people are looking for trusted sources of news. I would say, working in this business is never going to be like, being in something that's really booming, I guess maybe healthcare or certain areas of tech, but you can definitely make a good living. And I think that the experience that I have, particularly in economics and business, which requires more, I would say, sector expertise than, say, covering the arts or culture perhaps does, it's an advantage.
So what drove your new book? What's it about? And let's focus on that for a little bit.
Sure. So the new book, Homecoming, is about the move from unfettered globalization to what I believe will be a new world of regionalization, localization, more of a focus on kind of remooring wealth and place. And when I talk about that, what I'm referring to is in the last 40 or 50 years, we've seen a process of globalization that's been based on neoliberal economics, and that philosophy, that neoliberal philosophy, was that capital goods and people could all travel seamlessly across borders, and that they were all going to be able to end up where it was most productive for them to do so, and that all boats would rise. And for a certain period of time, that was true. There was a lot of wealth created at a global level in the last half century, but there were some downsides to globalization. It created a lot of in-country inequality in many countries, a lot of backlash, populist backlash on the part of voters who really felt that the global economy had become too disconnected from their own communities and from the well-being of their communities, their jobs. And so I think we're now at a pivot point for a lot of reasons, which I can get into, and I think that we're going to see more of a focus on local as well.
So would you say like the war in Ukraine is changing globalism or kind of hampering it? Or if not, what events do you think are really changing the the whole move from globalism maybe to more regional trading partners or even nationalism?
Yeah, well, certainly we're moving to more of a regional world. That was happening even before the war in Ukraine or the pandemic. But since then, we've seen a real speeding up of supply chain decoupling. The idea that Germany, for example, was ever going to get the majority of its energy from Russia, which is a country run by an autocrat who could change directions at any moment and has, it kind of seems like folly now. And similarly, the idea that we get 92% of all our high-end semiconductors from Taiwan, which is also a very politically contentious place. Really, people are beginning to tune into these risks. And these are risks not only because of geopolitics, but also because of concentration. The companies have gotten bigger and more powerful. They've also become more concentrated. There's a superstar effect in which a handful of companies in most critical sectors control the majority of trade, of commerce, and so people are really trying to think, gosh, is that a resilient system? It may be very efficient, but is it resilient? And so with the end of cheap energy coming from Russia, cheap labor coming from China, and China is now really becoming much more protectionist and wants to ring-fence its own supply chain, I think that there's going to be much more regionalization and more of a push for redundancy in supply chains, and also a push to make sure that local communities, particularly in richer countries, are not hollowed out because companies are, say, moving labor and intellectual property to places where jobs that, you can pay less money, or there's no privacy laws, and they kind of go race to the bottom.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show.
So, what do you see as happening with globalism, let's say in the short term, over the next year or two? What do you think is going to change in the world economic picture?
Well, I think we're just going to see a speeding up of all the things that we've already seen. Really, since the last 10 years or so, trade in traditional goods and services has been flattening because companies are looking and they're saying, this sort of cheap labor in Asia thing is tapped out. Energy is more expensive. There's new technologies like additive manufacturing that enable us to make things closer to home, and that's actually more convenient, and maybe it's better for the planet. And, we can sort of do local for local production. That's just speeding up now. That's really starting to speed up. And there are certain rules and new regulations that are putting a, sort of a tailwind to that. I would say things like the CHIPS Act in the U.S., which is encouraging local production of semiconductors. Europeans have a similar. And I think things like more environmental cost challenge, companies really having to look at their supply chains and say, are they energy efficient? How much carbon are they emitting? And then as they do that, they're going to start thinking, well, you know what, maybe we ought to start reshoring a bit more, moving to some jobs and some production to places where it's either, you're seeing higher environmental standards or better labor standards. That's very much a live discussion and trade debate right now. So, the IPEF trade negotiations which are going on between the U.S. and a number of Asian countries are really, really focused on can we lift environmental standards, can we lift labor standards in these places? And if we can't, well, we really can't sign these deals because we can't have a race to the bottom, yet again, and at this time in higher-end services and goods, like we did in the 90s and the 2000s.
So how do you think, which sectors do you think are going to win, let's say, temporarily if a recession, hits this coming year?
Well, for sure, I think it's going to be mid-size industrials, smaller mid-size industrials. These are, in the U.S. in particular, these are kind of the hidden gems, I would say, of our economy. They've been out of favor for a long time. Tech was in favor. Now tech is correcting, in part because, tech is the most global industry. It's very concentrated, and as things begin to regionalize and localize, tech companies are feeling that pinch more than others. On the other hand, industrials that are located in country, not just in the U.S., but in other places that are doing regionalization and localization like Germany and parts of Asia, I think that those are really going to see an uptick. And also, as you see climate change technologies incentivized, things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., which is meant to encourage investment into new production of clean tech, that's going to favor industrials as well.
Any major changes that you see coming because of your experience with journalism, and I'm sure because you talk to many different people in many different sectors all the time, like what do you feel like you're seeing that maybe is not being talked about or acknowledged in the news very much?
Well, one thing, and it sort of ties into my book but also goes beyond it, the work from home trend that we saw, and I'm working from home. I don't know if you are, but many people that I'm dealing with on a daily basis are working from home now. That's great in a lot of ways. It's given us a lot of flexibility. But as the CEO last year told me, if you can do the job in Tahoe, you can do it in Bangalore. And so I'm getting a little bit concerned that we may see higher-end white-collar job outsourcing of the kind that we saw with blue-collar jobs in the 90s and the 2000s. If that happens, I think that is going to be a major political issue. So that's something I'm watching. I'm also looking very much at the rise of millennial voters. Younger voters are finally beginning to show up. You saw that in the midterms. They're not out in force as much as they might be, but they're starting to have an effect. I think that we're going to see more of a push for a social safety net, for government interaction in the economy, and I think at some point, too, we're going to see a little bit of a square-off between the millennials and the baby boomers for their share of the pie. We've got a bit of a shrinking pie right now, probably going to see some softening in the economy in the next year or two, and young people want, say, student debt relief, but older people want to make sure that their entitlements don't get cut back, and I think at some point that's going to become a real political battle in the U.S.
All right, I understand when you're talking about the work from home phenomena. I mean, a lot of sectors are able to do that, but there are sectors that are not, manufacturing, et cetera. So I guess the tech sectors and, even service, I guess some will be able to move to, to work from home, but some of it will have to be physical brick and mortar or in-person type activity. So how do you think that that's going to be affected? Let's say manufacturing, do you see that, there's a big push to bring manufacturing back to the United States, or are people really not awake yet, and it's just like a very slow, gradual type thing?
Well, it already is coming back. You saw this year, in fact, that jobs in manufacturing not only went up to the pandemic, pre-pandemic peak, but they went beyond it. So we really are in a manufacturing resurgence already. Manufacturing, though, is changing. It's going to be much more of a blend of old line factory jobs, services, R&D, tech. The Internet of Things is bringing all the innovations that we've seen in smartphones, consumer space. That's all now coming to businesses. So when I go to factories, I see people still doing old line factory jobs, but I see them also doing a lot of tech work, a lot of service work, and I think that there will be some more flexibility, perhaps. A lot of things can actually be done remotely, even by folks using computers in totally different spaces. So I think even in the manufacturing sector, you can see more flexibility. That said, I think that because of the geopolitical issues and the sense that there's got to be a certain amount of domestic manufacturing and resiliency, I don't think that you're going to see an outsourcing of the jobs that have to do with making things in this country. I think that we've already passed the peak of that.
Great. So what do you think are going to be some of the positive aspects of this deglobalization, and what do you think are going to be some of the negative ones? It sounds like things will be less just-in-time, less efficient, but maybe cheaper because they don't have to travel as far, or do you think there's going to be a fragmentation in the labor market? Like what do you see as happening?
So I wouldn't say cheaper. In fact, the sort of cheap for cheap's sake paradigm is going away, I think, because, it is going to be somewhat inflationary in the short term to have better paid labor and to, actually think about things like carbon emissions, environmental standards. I mean, if you want a $5 T-shirt, sure, you can get child labor in Xinjiang, and you can get that $5 T-shirt. But if you want a product that's well made by people that make a living wage and, and aren't destroying the environment, it is going to cost more. But I think that this plays into really a larger shift to a less disposable world. I mean, you're already seeing that even in the fashion sector, which is kind of shocking to me. That's one of the sectors that's very polluting, very hard on the environment. But even in that sector, you're seeing a lot of companies start to think much more deeply about their environmental impact, and you're seeing shoppers that want to have companies work within the circular economy. They want to, buy fewer things but better things. And I think that fast fashion paradigm is going away. So yes, inflation, but certainly more thought about sustainability. I think you're going to see higher-end jobs, but also maybe fewer jobs, because as we replace a certain amount of human labor with technology, jobs will go up market, but there's also going to be fewer of them. So I don't think you're going to go back to, say, 2,000 people working in a single factory. It's going to be maybe more like 200, but those jobs are going to be better. So those are some things I see. In terms of information flows and data flows, I think that there's going to be higher levels of cross-border trade in data and digital services, but there may be a one world, two systems paradigm where China has its own systems, standards, technologies, privacy paradigms, and the U.S. and other liberal democracies have their own. Now, where Europe ends up in this is still a bit of a question mark, because they're kind of trying to hedge their bets right now between the U.S. and China.
What are going to be some of the countervailing forces that are just going to drag on everything, in your estimation?
Well, I think that particularly if we see a slowdown and if we see inflation continue to be an issue, you're going to see a lot of people saying, well, we just have to think about consumer prices, the only metric that matters, and there'll be a push to kind of go back to the old, cheaper is better paradigm. I'm worried about that, because I think looking for just cheap everything doesn't favor U.S. labor. It doesn't favor high quality. It favors fast, efficient, just-in-time, cheap. But as we've seen, again, even before the pandemic, even before war in Ukraine, that comes with a lot of risk. I always talk about the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2011 in Bangladesh. It was a perfect example of retail outsourcers not even knowing where their supply chain was. And it turns out that big brands are sourcing to a factory in Bangladesh that had this terrible standards and ended up with a fire. It collapsed. It killed 1,100 people. I could give you 12 different stories of that kind. I also hear from a lot of businesses that, frankly, highly globalized, just-in-time supply chains are very prone to disruption because they're very concentrated. So with more climate disruption, more geopolitical disruption, I just think that you're going to see a whole different way of doing things in business. And maybe even going back to vertical integration, the kind of River Rouge model, that Detroit used to have, where you had a car factory that owned the raw materials and the widgets and kind of, did everything in a hub that it could control. So you could see more of that.
Well, since you've been a journalist for so long, you've been through various recessions and, more good times than bad, I guess, but, still some. What's different this time? Or is it just, hey, we're cycling again, as we always have? Yeah, I know it's like a open-ended question, but do you see that, the economic conditions are very different from what we've ever seen before, or this is not this is not new, it's just par for the course as things slow down? Or do you think like we're in a really unique set of circumstances right now economically?
Oh, I think it's pretty unique. I mean, I think this is sort of a once-in-a-70-year paradigm shift. If you think about the neoliberal ethos, it was really born in the 1930s in Europe. between the two great wars, and you had a lot of political economists, thinkers that were saying, okay, how can we make sure countries don't go to war together again? And the way that they came up with was to connect global capital and business across borders, and that was great, and it worked for a certain period of time. But after we got to a certain place, in particular with trade and the global trade system, allowing countries with very, very different political philosophies to do trade with one another in ways that you just didn't have an even playing field. So when you start getting a lot of state-run capitalist societies, countries with, autocratic governments or single government systems trying to trade with free market countries, it didn't work. Wasn't a flat, even playing field. And so we also got, I would say, a lot of financially driven growth, growth that was based much more on asset prices going up than it was on income going up. And I think we've just reached the end of that. In a country like the U.S., where you've got an economy that's based 70% on consumer spending, if people don't have more money in their paycheck, then the math kind of stops working, and that's where we really are right now. And you're seeing the end of cheap money with quantitative easing ending, end of cheap labor with countries regionalizing, localizing, and the end of cheap energy. So I just think we really are at a very different place going forward economically.
So the average consumer, let's say in the U.S., what kind of adjustments are they going to have to go through in terms of their lifestyle and spending? And what's this going to do to them and to families in the U.S. and households?
Well, I'm worried about working people because, of course, inflation, in fact, all negative economic trends always hit them hardest. But I think that it's important that we not go back to just jack up the share prices, push down the consumer prices as much as possible, because the problem is that doesn't create good jobs. It might create cheap televisions at Walmart, but it doesn't make education or healthcare or housing more affordable for average people, and that's really where we need to go. I personally think that the Biden administration is doing a great job addressing some of these issues, but it's a slow process. When we had the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, things didn't change overnight. They changed over a period of time, and I think that's where we are now. One thing I would very much like to see is a conversation about education. I think that we have way too much student debt. We have a lot of people going to four-year colleges that don't really need that education, could be doing online learning combined with vocational skills training, and even high schools that offer, say, 2 years of community college as part of the high school degree. I just think that there could be a lot more efficient ways of helping people to get a leg up without having to go into debt.
Okay. So what's the goal with your book? What is your goal? Is it to kind of put all your thoughts of what's happening now and to give people a picture of what to expect, or what sectors might do well going forward, or what was your intent in writing? What do you hope people get out of it that read it?
Well, I always hope when people read my book that they come away with a new, fresh worldview. I think that there was a kind of a conventional wisdom. It was expressed actually in Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, that unfettered globalization was the future. There was nothing we could do about it. This is where the world was headed, end of history, all of that. And I don't think that's the case. I think we are moving towards a world in which you're going to have some remooring of wealth in place, some sense that the economy is working for communities, for labor, not just for technocrats, at a global level or multinational companies. And so I hope when people read that they come away with some sense of that's happening, and also some hope and some ideas about how it will happen.
Okay. Well, very good, Rana. What's the best way to get the book? Is it on Amazon and wherever books are sold? Is it out and available right now?
Yeah, it's out and available. It's on Amazon. If you go to my website, Rana Foroohar, RANAFOROOHAR.com, see all the many ways that you can purchase the book, and you'll also be able to read a few snippets from it and see some endorsements. So hope everybody has a look, and thanks for the time talking about it.
Yeah, Rana, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Emil. Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes. You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.